And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us. My name is Sabrina Lamb, and I am the founder and the executive director. Oh, one second, one second, one second. One second. It's extra stuff that wasn't us. So I'm the founder and executive director of the World of Money. Now, some of you may think, well, why are we having this talk today with the esteemed professor Shane White about the life of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? Well, for the last 16 years, we have been committed to providing immersive financial education for children ages 7 to 18. And from our perspective, financial education also includes financial history. We must learn everything in terms of the African American experience, the Latino experience as relates to Wall Street. And from our experience, from the African American experience, all of our experiences on this planet does not stem just from slavery or being enslaved people. So I was really excited when I learned of this story and this amazing, well-researched book. So I'm going to welcome our special guest. And this is an interactive conversation. Yes, we're going to open the floor in about 60 minutes, maybe a little bit less, but start having your questions and everything because you are included in this conversation. So I would like to introduce Shane White, who is the Challis Professor of History in the Department of History at the University of Sydney in Australia. From 2011 to 2015, he was an Australian Research Council Professorial Fellow. Shane's research and area of expertise includes United States history, African American history, and the history of New York City. He is a co-author of Playing the Numbers, Gambling in Harlem Between the Wars, The Sounds of Slavery, Discovering African American History Through Songs, Sermons, and Speech, and a collaborative project, The Year of the Riot, about Harlem in 1935. So as I said, for the next 75 minutes, which is going to include your questions, we're going to learn the story from his well-researched bestseller, The Prince of Darkness, the untold story of Jeremiah G. Hamilton, America's first Black millionaire. Good day, mate. Hello and welcome, Professor Shane.
Good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for getting up so early in Australia. We really appreciate you being here.
No worries at all.
So we're going to take a journey, everyone, from the Caribbean to New York, to upstate New York, to New Jersey, back to New York, to Brooklyn. Tell us, Shane, who was Jeremiah G. Hamilton when he boarded that ship from St. Croix to New York City?
We know very little about him, about his origins. There are different stories he told about where he came from and what he was. So possibly he was born in Virginia and came up to New York probably in around about 1828. I think he probably came from the Caribbean, probably from, my guess is that he probably came from somewhere near Port-au-Prince in Haiti. What was born in the first Black Republic would be my guess. Because of the revolution in Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, there is a large number of people shifting around in the Caribbean, and I think he was part of the flotsam and jetsam that came out of that. And he comes up to somehow he gets in with a consortium of New York merchants in 1828, and they fund him and send him back down to Port-au-Prince with a whole bunch of counterfeit coin for him to shove, is the term, to get rid of counterfeit coin. And he goes down to Haiti with several $1,000s worth of counterfeit coin, and he gets caught. They get found out down there. The counterfeit coin. New York was the thing America was probably one of the things America was famous for, which it doesn't acknowledge, is that it was the world center of counterfeiting. There's more counterfeit, something like between 30 and 40% of the currency in America was counterfeit. It's a very weird financial system that America has. It's mostly counterfeit notes rather than coin, but this was counterfeit coin that was coined probably in New Jersey or possibly up in Canada and then sent down to Haiti. They get caught because the counterfeit coin had too much silver content. It was too good in a way. And someone in the bank tests the coin and finds out that it's way above what the Haitian silver content of the Haitian coin is. And so he knows he's caught. They know the game's up, and he sort of runs away and hides, and is sort of sheltered by Haitian fishermen for a couple of days before he can hop on a boat and go back to New York City. And there's a big fuss about it up in New York because the South in America is terrified of Haiti, doesn't want anything to do with Haiti because they're feared of slave rebellions and the rebellious ideas coming out of Haiti. But the North is trading with Haiti and selling a lot of stuff down there. And so the big fuss in the New York newspapers is about how the reputation of America as a trading partner is being ruined by this guy selling counterfeit coin. And the first ever black newspaper has started up in 1827, Freedom's Journal, and they're horrified by what Hamilton has done, because to them Haiti is a beacon of the possibility of what the future can be, and this guy is undermining it and trying to ruin it. So this is his first. This is where he suddenly appears on the historical record. Before 1828, we know nothing.
And he was about in his 20s. He left Haiti not because he wanted to go and tour New York, but he was sentenced to death. Correct? He was under that kind of duress. And John Russwurm, who he created with his business partner, Freedom Journal, the first African-American newspaper in America, your early research, his coverage of Jeremiah Hamilton and his friends in terms of what they were doing in Haiti. Was that the first documented in terms of a newspaper, John Russwurm's coverage of Jeremiah?
Well, the coverage in the Freedom's Journal is mostly reprinted articles from other newspapers with Russwurm's editorial comment on the top saying, "Isn't this horrible?" and then prints from the Commercial Advertiser or various other things. This is the first, the white newspapers or that print stories about this in early 1828. That's the first mention. Freedom's Journal jumps on the bandwagon and condemns even more strongly than the other newspapers do what Hamilton has been doing down in Haiti.
And I think it's worth just taking a pause for a second to outline what the backdrop was of New York at that time. When he arrived here in New York, the government had just abolished slavery, which doesn't mean, everything goes back to normal or we're treating African Americans or anyone in a humanistic way. But could you just lay out what the backdrop was when he arrived here, and what did he look like?
Well, this slavery ends gradually in New York State, and for the what you've got to remember is that New York is probably the first city or place of any size that has to deal with what happens after slavery. So it's one of the pioneers in working out what do you do with free blacks, as they are now, often called free coloreds. What's going to be the relationship? And it's being negotiated. As far as many whites are concerned, African Americans are going to be pretty much in the same position, only you don't call them slaves anymore. As far as African Americans are concerned, freedom has got to mean something that's a whole lot better than slavery. And so there's this pushing and shoving, trying to work out what the situation actually is. New York in the late 1820s, 1830s, and into the first half of the 1840s, the result of freedom actually is there's a cultural convulsion. Things are going backwards and forwards between black and white in ways that's not going to happen again until the 1920s and the 1930s with the Harlem Renaissance. So this can range from tap dancing, for example, is invented in New York City in the dancing cellars that are part of the response to the end of slavery. So it's black and white are dealing with one another in completely new ways. And that includes violence, so that there's a lot of pushing and shoving around the edges. And every now and again, things will just erupt into violence. 1834 is one of the worst race riots in New York City's history. And then in 1863, the draft riots is undoubtedly the worst point of race relations in New York City's history. And in between there's sporadic violence. So a black man or woman walking down the street, for the most part, nothing's going to happen. But there's the potential for pushing and shoving and using the M word and sort of disrespecting them. On the other hand, blacks are now free, and there's this ebullience of African American culture expressed in dance, in clothing, so you get long accounts of blacks walking up Broadway wearing what seems to whites outrageous clothes and top hats and twirling their sticks and not giving the wall, as in not moving into the street and allowing whites to walk closer to the wall, because the streets are full of water and crap, basically. And so the further you can get from the street when you're walking down the sidewalk, the more likely you are not to get covered in the stuff being put up. So blacks are not giving the wall to the whites anymore. So freedom is literally being negotiated on the street as to who can walk where. And so blacks are no longer deferential. And whites notice this. And so the newspapers, there's a constant litany of complaint about the way blacks just aren't behaving the way they used to, is the sort of tone of this lament.
So Jeremiah,
and as to Jeremiah Hamilton, we have very little descriptions of him. There's probably a picture of him somewhere in an archive somewhere or other that is filed under anonymous African American. But this one account calls him a dark mulatto. Mulatto being a reference to a mixed race person. So his skin color was possibly dark. What he's notorious for is that he actually, when he arrives in New York to live in the mid-1830s, he shaves his head and wears a wig. So he's famous for his long flowing, quite spectacular wig. Mm-hmm. He had a sort of a high-pitched voice, which sort of was distinctive and could be heard, had one of those voices that, at a party, one of those voices that people can hear above the hubbub, which, given his penchant for sort of gossip and what have you, sometimes was unfortunate. He was overheard, which again didn't probably probably didn't endear him to some people.
Well,
Uh,
well, just want to make sure we covered this point.
yeah.
He was doing business with New York merchants in this counterfeit ring, and then Haiti was really designated as a mulatto. Were his colleagues with the counterfeit ring, were they mulattoes? Were they black? Were they white? And when he arrived, and it seems like in your book, you stopped short of saying that he was passing, that he was never passing. He was just himself. Is that
He was,
accurate?
yeah. I think he was that dark mulatto. I think he was too dark to pass. If you, I don't think he could. And everyone knew him, so he is notorious from the 1830s on. He's called the Prince of Darkness or N-word Hamilton or things like that. So there was no way he was going to pass. The merchants he's dealing with remain anonymous. I have suspicions as to who one of them was, at least one of them was, but they're white. So he is the front person for a bunch of whites going down, which is quite remarkable. You'd love to have been there when he was rounded up for this, because he was 20 years old, which you started work younger than you do nowadays often, but still 20 was very, very young to be put in charge of this. He must have, he was very, very talented. He was a talented guy. I would love to have met him. I admire his skill and his ability to do things. He reminds me of sort of one of those very smart young black kids who ends up to, either being a drug dealer, a basketball player, or something or other, who goes into something. There are constraints on what talented young African Americans can do in American history. The thing I like about him is that he actually jumps into a milieu that's totally white. Wall Street is absolutely white, and normally the pioneer African American in any field has to be quiet, polite, deferential, wear a suit and tie, sort of like Jackie Robinson had to be restrained when he broke into the major leagues. They constantly trying to throw buckets of water over him to calm him down, and saying Jeremiah Hamilton wasn't like that. You hit him, he hit you back and added 10%. And so he is Malcolm X, not Martin Luther King, if you like.
Let's pause here for a poll. I want for everyone, answer this poll. When did you first hear of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? Could you answer the poll there? When did you first hear of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? And then we have a million questions to ask Professor Shane. Okay. When did you first hear of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? Okay, so he's here. He's in New York City. I always want to know I'm following the flow of money. How did he access capital, and what was to launch his first business, and what was his first business?
Well, he actually struggles when he comes into New York in the 1831, 32. And for a while, he's sort of on the fringes of Wall Street. He actually makes his first money by, again, and it's fraudulent. You got to remember that Wall Street, there are almost no rules or laws on Wall Street. The place was a place of dog eat dog. And he has shipping ventures. He over-insures the shipping ventures and then arranges for the ships to be sunk. So he can.
But where did he get the money? Where did he get the money to do this?
It's again, we don't know. He had money. way I traced him was through lawsuits in the 1830s,
Right.
when he or insurance companies are suing him, or he's suing insurance companies. He puts together stuff. I don't know. He's borrowing money. And so some of those lawsuits are because he hasn't paid money back, or he owes money, or things like that. So it's actually so one place where I know he got a lot of money was in 1835. A bunch of white guys go to him and give him $25,000, which is the equivalent of $10 million now, right. An awful lot of money, to invest on Wall Street, in the share market, bond market, whatever. And what actually happens is that the biggest disaster in New York history until 9/11 occurs, and there's a big fire down in the business end of town, and almost 700 houses burned down. And those 4 white merchants, their premises were burnt down, so they got no paperwork left. And those four white guys go and see Jeremiah Hamilton and say, "We're ruined. We've lost everything, but at least we've got the $25,000 we invested with you." And he sort of looked up from the desk and said, "What $25,000? And they had no paper. And he walked away with that $25,000. That's the money he uses to invest in real estate in what is the biggest real estate boom in American history that's occurring in 1837, 36, 37. And he buys a whole bunch of land up in Poughkeepsie.
And Astoria, Hollis Crow,
yes,
now Astoria. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So he buys, Astoria and Poughkeepsie.
And New Jersey. He bought a mansion in New Jersey, correct?
That's in the 1840s. That's a few years later. But the initial plunge in 1836, 37 is in what becomes Astoria, and then up in Poughkeepsie. The whole world in 1836, America from Florida to Maine is just going insane over real estate. There's this incredible boom going on. So you get accounts in the newspapers of saying the share market is just dead, but the real estate market is just ridiculous. Like town lots, as in vacant lots uptown, are sort of doubling in price in 2 months, type of that sort of stuff. And inevitably, as happens with every boom, it busted. And as it happens, like Jeremiah Hamilton was very, very shrewd, but he bought about 2 weeks before the crash. So he bought real estate and ends up losing money on the real estate. And that sort of drags him. From 1837 to 42, there's basically a depression in America. And Hamilton gets caught up in that.
And according to your book, let's see, only 60 African Americans own real estate in around that time. So he was, and you had to, in order to vote, you had to own real estate. Did you see any records of him voting at all?
No, none at all. It's very, the real estate, initially back in the turn of the century, African Americans could vote and did vote. And so, reputedly, the mayoral election in 1814 was decided by black votes. What happens in the 1820s as part of that reaction to blacks becoming free is that restrictions are put on the vote. So you get the vote extended to all white people, but a property qualification was put on African Americans. I think it was $250 worth of property you had to own. And so this restricts to a handful of voters in the whole of New York State, but those who could vote. So there's democracy for all whites, but restricting black votes. The push towards democracy for whites eliminates pretty much the black vote, and it's not going to be returned for some time.
And there are other examples of what he was called ruthless. And then other people will say you had to be ruthless if you wanted to survive. Could you share other examples in terms of him being ruthless in business?
He was well, one of the ones I really liked was he got into a dispute with a bunch of whites over money for a venture that was taking longer than it should have. And so at that time, Hamilton lived up at Bloomingdale, which is up near Columbia University, up to the top left-hand corner of Central Park. And his opponents arranged for him to be arrested, but they arranged for him to be arrested at 11 o'clock at night so he couldn't post bail, so that he had to spend the night in prison. It was just a way of humiliating him. And so he's dragged out in there. About 2 weeks later, those whites are woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning and they're arrested, and and bail was set so high they had to stay several days in prison locked up before they could get out. Again, you hit him, he comes straight back for your throat, and adds a little bit for good measure. So that's the sort of stuff. Like, business is not just buying and selling shares and what have you. There's a whole range of activities, and so the courts, and in this case, prison, are sort of part of the spectrum of what's going on. There was a very little gap between legitimate business, crooked business, and getting caught. It really was a place of caveat emptor. You had to look at what you were buying all the time, and trust no one. Always count every bit of money that comes towards you. So that everything is up for negotiation. It's on the one hand, New York is taking off. At the Erie Canal in the 1820s, New York has become the financial center of America, and the population is just zooming away. So in 1830s, 200,000 people living in New York. It's 500,000 by 1850. So New York is taking off. It's boom and bust. It's rapid expansion. There's this incredible sense of liveliness and stuff on the streets. Hamilton jumps into this world, embraces it with enthusiasm, and is just that little bit more pushy and ruthless than white people, because he had to be to survive in that world.
And there was tension between Jeremiah and the Black community. Talk about that.
Well, Freedom, right from when we were talking at the beginning about the counterfeit thing, Freedom's Journal was unhappy with him, to put it mildly. He doesn't associate with other African Americans. He marries a white woman. He doesn't live near blacks. Even his charity cases, like his very good friend Benjamin Day, he has a poor woman living in his house and helps her, but she's white, not African American. His best friend is white. He hangs around with the newspaper people, particularly at the Sun, and is seen walking home from a pub arm in arm with a white man. The other richest black person in New York is a guy called Thomas Downing, who owns an oyster cellar near the corner of Broad Street and Wall Street. And he wouldn't allow African Americans into his oyster cellar. But on the other hand, he wrote checks for the civil rights movement and helped fund the civil rights movement and was involved in various civil rights cases. Mm-hmm. Hamilton wasn't like that. He just doesn't associate with them, with African Americans at all. So every now and again, you get a sort of a moderately scathing comment from one of the African American leaders.
Did he see himself as African American or Black? Did he?
Sorry?
See himself? Did Jeremiah see himself as Black, or in terms of the African American part of that community, or culturally?
Not culturally. It's very difficult to see. Most biographies, if you go and read a biography, are based on diaries, oral histories that allow the author to get inside the head of Jeremiah Hamilton. I have got very few words directly from Jeremiah Hamilton's, just 15 words probably from Jeremiah Hamilton's. I have to try and work out what he thinks or what he's doing from his actions.
Right.
And so this is difficult. So my guess is that he didn't identify with African Americans at all. And what we have is those occasional things, like he was the person who desegregated Delmonico's, for example, the fancy food emporium / restaurant. And that was, I don't think that was an attempt to desegregate it. So he didn't think about it as desegregating it. He just wanted to behave like his white peers were, and just sort of imperiously strode in there and expected to be served. So he was aware he was Black, and he was. I think he would. And he's married a white woman.
A white girl.
He was when they first got together. She was like 14 years old, and he was in his late 20s. Mm-hmm. Every time he walked down the street, arm in arm with and he ends up it's a stable relationship that lasts for 40 years. They have 10 children. But every time he walks down the street, arm in arm with her, he's going to be he's waiting for the incident to happen, some sort of racial, because race relations are very sensitive, and there's few things that are more of a red rag to the bull than a Black man walking down the street arm in arm with a white woman. So he was he's aware that that's a red rag to the bull, and I think he was waiting his whole life for some sort of racial incident to it, which eventually it does in the draft rights in 1863.
Start putting your questions in the chat. I'm going to definitely open up the room very soon. I'm curious. I'm always curious about stories of access. And so he was a broker. He was an insurance broker. He owned real estate, Astoria, Poughkeepsie, a mansion in New Jersey, lived on East 29th Street for the remainder of his life. But how does one, and that's a problem even today, how did he access the markets where he was able to buy stocks and be a trader at that point, when all these years later, we're still talking about access?
Again, it's difficult. He had access.
He didn't ask for permission to do much. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, he didn't. What we know is he had access. Yeah. And the interesting access issue was whites trying to get his advice on what stocks to buy. They were sort of scrabbling around, sending him, and we had, through one lawsuit, they're sending him cases of champagne and fancy cigars in order to get him to allow them to invest their money with him. So you have this weird thing of a black man in the 1850s and 60s giving advice to whites on what stocks to buy, and many of the stocks are railroad stocks or steamship stocks, when he often wouldn't be allowed on the trains,
Right.
or would be segregated off somewhere or other on the boat. But his advice was seen as being really good. He was a hot person to go in and invest your money with. Now, there's still a crooked element to what he does, in that he had this habit of, if shares went up, then the profits was Hamilton, but if shares went down, then his clients socialized the loss, if you like. So and there are disgruntled clients who were going to be suing him in the 1850s and the 1860s. Weirdly, he becomes more respectable in his old age, so that by the 1860s and the 1870s, he's sort of seen as being, and by then he's one of the older people on Wall Street. He's sort of one of the older sage people that people went to for advice.
Everything wasn't, zippity doo dah, because at one point he did lose everything. I mean, he worked to get it back, but talk about that, so that we're not just painting a story where everything was just wonderful, that he had financial issues as well.
Yes, he did. And if we go back to the 1830s, he invested heavily in real estate about a week before the market plunged. His real estate investments would have been fine in the long run if he could have hung on to it. But what he was also dealing with, buying sugar in the Caribbean, and he had given money to someone else to pay a debt, and that person went bust, and therefore his debt wasn't paid. And so someone else as often happens when the market goes down, someone else failing ended up dragging him down. And for 4 or 5 years there, he's fending off bankruptcy. What actually happens is there are so many bankrupt people in America that the federal government introduces an experimental bankruptcy law for about 12 months in 1841 or 42. And this is very generous to the bankrupt in terms of it's an easy way out. And that's part of the reason it was closed down after 12 months. But on the 5th day that this law is in operation, Hamilton goes bankrupt officially. And what he did, again, as I said, there were so many people going bankrupt, and all the bankrupts' assets were being auctioned off. And so he goes bankrupt and then buys back some of his assets for about $10. So he buys back some of his real estate and stuff. So like, even the way, the interesting thing here is you would think of the pioneer sort of in any area, sort of feeling around, not quite knowing how it works, but he is operating in the most savvy fashion possible. He is at the clever end of this, of knowing how to exploit this new bankruptcy law in the fashion. And you're in limbo for about 3 months while you're going bankrupt. And from another court case, it appears that he was supposed to be doing no financial transactions. He was actually buying shares under another name, and there was a lawsuit over that. So he's bending the law, he's breaking the law as well. But he's also very sharp, very canny, admirable entrepreneurial skill.
What was his relationship? And we're coming to your questions at 5:45 Eastern. That's 4 minutes now. What was his relationship with Richmond, Virginia?
That's one of the places where he may have been if he was born in Virginia, he was born there. So one of the interesting things I found where you have those discoveries when you're an orphan, where you go, oh wow, I didn't know that. It turns out there's the library in New York in the 18th century was the New York Society Library. The New York Society still exists today up on the Upper East Side. But then it was downtown, down near University Place. And it was a subscription library where you paid money down and then you could go in and take books. And being a sort of a reputable, basically white institution, they kept a record of every book you borrowed. And it turned out he was a member. And so I found a list of, I don't know, 250 books he borrowed over 20 years. And he borrowed a whole bunch of books about Richmond, particularly during the Civil War and after Richmond pretty much burns to the ground during the Civil War. A lot of it's burnt. And so there were he had books about Richmond, which to me, again, and it could be a bit of a leap, suggested that if he wasn't born and raised there, if he came from Haiti, he may have spent time in Richmond on the way up to New York. He was interested in what happened there. Whether he ever went there again or not, I don't know. Again, if you're writing a biography of, Lyndon Johnson or someone like that, you know pretty much where he was every day. There are periods of 4 or 5 years. I haven't got I think he's in New York, but I don't know for certain he is. So he's a slippery character to write about.
Right, and you document, for example, his daughter in the census when she would answer different places where her father was born and so forth. So that just multiply or just adds on to the mystery. But you do know he never returned to Port-au-Prince, correct?
Yeah. No, I assume the sentence of death that he was sentenced to be shot. That would tend to discourage people. Like there's another mystery too. Like his name is Jeremiah G. Hamilton, and in all the years I worked on the book, and if you look at his signature, he had this wonderful signature with flourishes and curlicues, and it centers on the G. The G is important to him. He doesn't sign Jerry Hamilton or Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah G. Hamilton. I have got no idea what the G stands for. Even his death certificate, on the instructions on the New York death certificate say, fill out his name in full here. And someone has just written in Jeremiah G. Hamilton. It didn't, I have no idea what the G stands for. So if the G were Guillaume or something other like that, that would strongly support him coming from Port-au-Prince or somewhere where French is spoke. But I got no idea if it's just Gordon or somebody. Then that's not so. So I have no idea. So there are still large areas of his life that, because he's an African American who is forgotten by history, that we know nothing about those areas.
On the other side of the questions from our guests, would love to hear you talk about his will. I love that he had a will and what was in it. Who has questions? Please raise your hand, and I think you can actually speak. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, no, yes? Raise your hand if you have any questions, or if you don't want to speak, put your question in the chat. No questions? Okay, so then let's talk about having a will or a trust in this country is one of the most urgent indicators of the transfer of generational wealth or not. Mm-hmm. And so back in the 1800s, Jeremiah G. Hamilton, he had a will. and he and his family lived on East 29th Street. His office, I love the addresses in the book, by the way, Shane. I want to mention next, so when everyone walks past there, you can say, oh yeah, this is where he lived. He worked on Front Street, I believe, and no, I'm sorry, 76 Liberty Street. And then, no, his office is 137 Front Street. And, but talk about his will. I know that, oh, here's a question. Wait a minute. Did he die with wealth or was he broke? Okay. Claudia wants to know. So talk about his will and the fact that he was trying to hire or pay a white person, a white man to marry his daughter. Talk about all of that.
Well, okay, he has a will, and when he dies, he's reputed to be worth $2 million, which is the equivalent of 200 million nowadays. Which was that fact was a sort of a minor headline in a sort of story. His death is noticed from California to Maine, and the little stories in the newspaper. You know, richest colored man dies, worth $2 million. There are stories about him. There's a story about him allegedly paying someone to marry his daughter. I don't think that was the case. I think that's sort of a bit of racist claptrap that goes about. There's a lot of resentment in the use of the M-word and talking about him. So I doubt that that's the case. One of the interesting things about Hamilton and the family is the extent to which wealth doesn't last in a family. The extent to which, his kids, he dies in 1876, 5 or 6, I can't remember. By 1900, which is when his wife, round about when she dies, there's almost nothing left. The wealth just, some families, the Rockefellers, have generations and generations of wealth, but there are lots of white families too that were rich, and then the whole lot just sort of disappears. And that sort of happened with Jeremiah Hamilton. His family disappeared, and of all his children, only one of them had children as well. So it died. The family sort of dies out. And when I was writing the book, I got in contact by a descendant who lived in France, and she had no idea she had a black ancestor. So that the family passed, whether consciously or not, in France. And there's one photograph in the book which is of one of Jeremiah Hamilton's daughter, who was the great grandmother or whatever of the woman who got in touch with me, who has since been to New York and been to Jeremiah Hamilton's grave out in the cemetery.
Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn.
Yes, and so again, as I said, Jeremiah Hamilton was totally unknown, but he's now. I did a Zoom talk with Greenwood Cemetery a few weeks ago, and he's now part of their tour of the famous people buried in Greenwood Cemetery. So his profile has gone up a little bit because during the 20th century he was totally expunged from American history. Are we talking about wealth? So when he died, he was wealthy. He was a millionaire, which was rather more important then than it is now, because $1 million was worth a lot more than it is today. But the wealth did not last long in the family. His kids, I think, probably lived off the wealth and ran it down, so that there was no, you know, there's no Hamilton University coming out of Jeremiah Hamilton's fortune, like there was with some of the famous white families who amassed large sums of money.
Melissa's asking, did his children continue his legacy with interest in the stock market? Any idea what career pursuits they had?
One of his sons was involved in the stock market in a fairly dilettantish fashion. Most of the other children who lived, because several of them die young, very young, as is pretty much the norm for the 19th century, were daughters. And I've got no idea what they did. I had their passport applications in the 1890s, so they were traveling. Some of them were traveling, but so no. And by the 20th century, the only African Americans you're going to find on Wall Street are going to be elevator operators in the skyscrapers. It's going to be a long time until African Americans get to play any sort of a role in the stock market. So he's a pioneer, but there's not much that follows him for a long, long time.
In the limited time we have left with Professor Shane White, please post your questions. What can we learn from Jeremiah G. Hamilton, and why has history largely ignored him? Why can't we find a photo? The photos that are online, everybody, that's not really him. So what can we learn?
Well, I think the reason it was ignored was when I first started working in African American history, and I was working on New York, Americans would sort of look at me and sort of say, I was working on the end of slavery, and they'd sort of look at me and say, slavery in New York? Oh, you're just a simple-minded foreigner who doesn't understand things. That has changed, and now people are aware that slavery existed in New York. Like even professional historians would sort of look at me, so really? You think you can write a book about that? Now the story pretty much is there was slavery in New York, slavery ended, and blacks were poor and were at the bottom of the heap. And we're waiting for the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and the 1930s before Black history becomes interesting. So Jeremiah Hamilton, who is in that period when blacks are poor, is an outlier. He's rich. And so he doesn't fit the pattern. He also doesn't fit the pattern because he's not writing checks for the civil rights movement. He's not involved in black rights. So he doesn't fit into the... He's not like James McCune Smith or various other black activists. So he just doesn't fit. And that means that very quickly after, like in the 1850s and 60s, he's well known. But after his death, he's forgotten very, very, very quickly. So in the 20th century, and thanks to Google and digital stuff, an awful lot of print is now searchable online. There are 4 mentions in print of Jeremiah Hamilton in the entire 20th century, and 3 of them have him totally factually incorrect. So he just sort of disappears without trace. What can we learn from Jeremiah Hamilton?
How can we amass a fortune without being corrupt? A little bit of corruption.
Well, a little bit of corruption. A little bit of corruption always helps, whether you're white or black. What can, like what I think I too often African American history is it's either saints or villains. It's either Martin Luther King or it's Nat Turner. And I think there's the full panoply of human life that exists in African American life too often is forgotten about. I think he's in the middle. He's a bit of a villain. He probably was never a saint, and he hoes out a life in New York that is interesting and doesn't fulfill. I love the way he breaks stereotypes, the way he is so aggressive. The stereotype of sexual relations between black and white is usually of white males and black females. If it's the other way around, if it's black males and white females, it's seen as being a fleeting relationship that doesn't last. His lasts for 40 years, and he has 10 children. He begins with the stereotype: a 28-year-old black man getting a 14-year-old white female pregnant, but it doesn't stay a stereotype. It becomes, as far as I know, a loving relationship, definitely one that lasted 40 years and produces that many children. So he's a human being, and looking at his life enables us to get away from some of those stereotypes that to this day bedevil any public discussion of race relations in America.
Touche. Sue's asking, was Jeremiah a Freemason?
Not as far as I know. The only thing I could find in joining was the New York Society Library, but I don't think he was. The Masons separate off into black Masons early in the 19th century, and as far as I know, he had nothing to do with them.
Any other association with any organization?
No. He may well have been member of stuff like I said, he was a member of the New York Society Library, which still exists today. They knew he was a member. They had no idea he was black. So in effect, their first black member of the New York Society was back in 1840s, maybe 50. I can't remember when he starts. But they themselves had no idea. He could well have been member of other organizations who also didn't know he was the first African American to be a member, and just be there in the records. Again, since I've written the book, every now and again I've stumbled across new little tidbits about him. When he's struggling, going bankrupt, in the late 1830s, there's a fire on one of his buildings that he owns up in Poughkeepsie, and it was one of those. I don't know about America, but in Australia there used to be some streets where fires could take out a building but not touch the buildings on either side, and the insurance claim was already written out so that their insurance. So this was an insurance fire done at 2 o'clock in the morning for $250 was the insurance thing. And as soon as I saw the little story, I said, that's my man. That's Jeremiah Hamilton, sort of stretching the law. Like, no one really minds that much when someone claims a little bit too much on an insurance company. Insurance companies are often seen as being it's all right to stretch the law just a little bit with insurance claims. A lot of people flirt the law, but
They
burning
should.
down a
They should
burning
not.
down a building or sinking a ship is definitely well over the
Oh, yeah.
over the law. So every now and again, bits and pieces surface, and I'm hoping sometime somewhere someone's going to come up with a photo. There's probably a painting of him somewhere too. I imagine he would have had a painting done of him that's probably anonymous African American stuck in somewhere, someone's attic or in a museum somewhere, but
Don't
it's
know
never
who
put
it
on
is.
display.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have about 10 remaining minutes. Definitely want to hear your questions or comments, everyone that's joining us. And thank you so much. And Professor Shane White is with us from the University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you so much for getting up so early in Sydney. This is a great conversation. I have two questions. It takes, I've written books. It takes a lot of emotional and intellectual energy to focus on one subject or person. Why did you decide to dedicate years in the research and the writing and the editing of this person? And it's a lot. So why? You can choose anyone. Why him?
Virtually all of my career, I have written about ordinary African Americans. And what I write about, I'm less interested in the African American middle class or leaders. It's ordinary African Americans. I write about street life, about drinking, about dancing, about music, about sound. I stumbled across Jeremiah Hamilton in reading New York newspapers. I came across a mention and I thought, it was a reference to M-word Hamilton and a fraud for $50,000. And I thought this was just a story about whites, and it was one of those reprehensible nicknames that you can still find down amongst hedge fund managers down on Wall Street. I remember talking to actually an Indian friend talking about the Prince of Darkness, and he was aware of Indians who are still within the last 10 years referred to as the Prince of Darkness when they're working down, it wasn't Wall Street, it was a financial market somewhere or other else. So I thought, I just took a note of this guy when I was reading in New York, and when I got back to Sydney, I looked up my own research and found I had another reference to this guy, and he was definitely black. So I kept on, once I was aware of his name, I kept on bumping into him over a year or two when I was reading stuff. And I got more and more interested in him and wondered if I could use the techniques I used to write about ordinary African Americans to write about someone who wasn't an ordinary African American. And the turning point came, I was in New York working in the New York Municipal Archives. And on the 7th floor is the New York County Clerk's office. And I went up there and they have court records and business records. And I went up there and it's full of lawyers, gophers and people racing around. And I said, have you got anything on Jeremiah Hamilton? And the guy waves me over and says, over there. And there's a index and I look and there's no mention. And something was wrong. So I went 6 months later, I went in again and said, Jeremiah, and he looks at me and my accent apparently confuses some people. And he said, oh, and he writes down 1910 to something or other over there, sort of talking slowly because I'm a foreigner. So I get his pen, I cross out the 1910 and I go 18. He goes, oh, come around here. And he takes me around the corner and there's a computer that someone's stolen from a museum. It's so old. And he says, what's the guy's name? He types it in. And it turned out they had 35 cases that Jeremiah Hamilton was involved. And as soon as I saw those cases and started reading them, I knew that there was a book there. So my aim was to try and write a book without having an autobiography to help me or a cache of letters that the New York Historical Society had archived away, to write a book about a man who had been totally forgotten. And it was fun. I enjoyed writing it. And of all my stuff that I've written, and I've written a fair bit, it's been the one that's excited the most interest. And people tend to read it and say, why isn't there a film about this guy? Which is a question I ask
you. The last that I heard that Don Cheadle was developing a script. What's going on with development?
I don't know what developing is going on, but he has optioned it, and he just renewed the option a few weeks ago, and he emailed me saying that he's a busy man and he's got lots of different programs to make, but in between he's trying to raise the money and what have you to get someone to finance it, which I think would be fun. I think he would be an interesting person. That's partly the great thing about talking to John Cheadle when he was, he and another actor were sort of bidding for the rights, was he had read the book and read it closely. Like, often I've been interviewed with people who read the blurb on the back and that's it. He had read the book and knew it in detail and had been thinking about it. So it was, and he's utterly charming. So it was flattering in the extreme. It was a Saturday morning and I was floating on clouds for the rest of the day after talking to him. I think that the great John Cheadle had read my book and enjoyed it. So.
Well, thank you so much for dedicating your expertise, your scholar, your everything to it, because it's a really brilliant. I have made some conclusions that he was from the Caribbean because, as you say in the book, he was fluent in French. And that may not have happened if he was born in Richmond, but everyone from Richmond, don't send me emails about that. But if there aren't any final questions, again, are there any final questions, everyone? Thank you all for joining us. Anyone, any questions? Where can we reach you? Where can our guests reach you? Our attendees reach you?
Best way to get me is email, and if you just hit Shane White and then the University of Sydney, I've got a page there and you'll see my email number and you can get in touch with me that way.
Sue's, this final question, Stu's asking, if we follow Jeremiah's template path to wealth today, for example, insurance industry and Wall Street, et cetera, would we become wealthy?
Possibly. It's in the lap of the gods, isn't it? You have to remember he was driven by that desire to be rich, and he would brook no opposition to him, and just sort of rode roughshod over anything that got in his way. So I don't know whether you would need the same determination to become rich that day. But America is famously, supposedly, is the land of opportunity. So quite possibly, yes. I'd certainly urge you to try.
Well, we encourage you, Sue, particularly if you have children, to enroll your children at World of Money. It's going to be virtual this year, so make sure you sign up for our newsletter at worldofmoney.org or worldofmoneyonline.org. Professor Shane White, again, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone in the chat, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.